Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, as well as good evening. We start the new week on a Monday, going into a topic that might be and might feel quite personal to some people. Some might even get offended. They will take this a little bit too seriously and a little bit too personally, which is the conviction that some people have. I guess everyone has this type of conviction deep down when they think about it. The conviction of which are Blizzard's favorite specs, the only child, the doted one, the one that always has that little extra eye for attention. Whenever you are playing in the mud, poor, homeless, a filthy hobo playing your hybrid spec that nobody else wants, and then you see one of the meta flavor of the month specs being slightly below average for 2 minutes, and then you see the hotfix that comes in and instantly buffs them again, and you convince yourself that this is all a scheme, you convince yourself that this is all a plan, that it took your spec about 6 years to be noticed by Blizzard and be made somewhat meta, whereas there have been several other specs that have remained super popular for very, very long. So we're going to go into these thoughts and these certainties that many people have. I have them myself, for the record, so I will share them with you today. Of course, all of this is worth nothing. It's basically just your headcanon on which of the specs are being given preferential treatment by Blizzard when it comes to mostly just balancing. Sometimes the more extreme conspiracy theorists are going to also go and extend this favoritism towards getting better looking sets, maybe better looking class-specific mounts in Legion, or perhaps some other cool things related only to their class. So when we start looking at all of this, we start, of course, with the tanks. There's only 6 of them, and also Death Knight has been added on the 3rd expansion, and then Monk has been added on the 5th expansion, and then Vengeance has been added on the 7th expansion. So there is room for multiple favorites here. Every time a new tank has been added, there could have been a paradigm shift on which Blizzard preferred. So purely based on my headcanon and on what I can remember from all of the previous tiers and trying to see, which of the tanks used to be more popular and powerful than usual, which of the tanks used to get the better tools more often than others, I would start by taking out Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin has always been somewhat in the middle. They have rarely been the top pick as a tank in multiple tiers, so I would leave it there, where they are right now already, in the middle. I would also take away Vengeance, Demon Hunter, for all of the flack and all of the certain conspiracy theories against Havoc Demon Hunter. Vengeance is not as bad. They have not gotten this bad of a rep. They weren't particularly OP or popular in Legion, despite the spec being new, fresh new, and also even less popular in BFA. They have gotten a resurgence at the start of Shadowlands because they were powerful at the start of the expansion, but still I don't think that's what Blizzard is going for when it comes to tanks. Based on what I can see, based on my whistleblowers that have contacted me to share their conspiracy theories about Blizzard and the tank spec, I would probably go for something like Warrior as a default, which is funny because everyone right now seeing Warrior is basically having in front of them a depressive sight. Very few people playing Warrior, the least played tank in Raids, the least played tank in Mythic Plus. How can this be Blizzard's favorite? Well, the game has been going on for over 15 years. Sometimes it can happen that even the favorite of Blizzard could reach this level. I am kind of on the fence though, because I have to point out that ever since the release, Brewmaster Monks have had a pretty good situation, a pretty good deal with Blizzard. The reputation with Blizzard for Brewmaster Monks is like revered. It's like halfway through Revered. They start to see the end of the journey now, and they're getting close to Exalted. They have been very, very good and stable as a popular tank for, well, a long time by now. Mists was like 7 years ago, so they have also received some quite noticeable attention from Blizzard over the years. Those would be my pick if I had to think about Blizzard's favorites when it comes to tanks. So, what about healers? Because the healer is a little bit different. There is only one new healer spec in over 16 years of the game, essentially, because it's Mistweaver, right? Restoration Shaman, Druid, as well as the 2 priest specs and Paladin are all very, very old as of healing specs. So let's just immediately remove as a favorite Let's remove Mistweaver. I think we can say pretty safely that Mistweaver is not really being given that much attention from Blizzard, except for when the spec was being released. Basically, Mist of Pandaria, they were actually pretty good. They had some highs here and there, but for too long and too often, they have been left sort of on the down low. Same goes for Holy Priest. You know, Holy Priest was one of the main healing specs back in the archaic days of WoW, Vanilla, TBC, even Wrath. After that, though, they have lost quite a lot. Absorbs have started being put into the game, and mass damage reduction has been put into the game as well, so its brother, Discipline, has taken hold of the attention for Blizzard when it comes to the priest slot. Holy definitely did not take as much attention from Blizzard, so we can now pivot directly to one of the favorites of Blizzard, which is of course Discipline. Discipline now, since the days of Mists of Pandaria, so again we're talking about since over 7 years, have basically been the premier and one of the only, at the very least, that can do it consistently and very easily, the only spec that is being given absorb shields. Sometimes some other specs got a legendary that could use absorb shields as healing. Sometimes they got something like an Azerite trait, but nothing close to what a Discipline Priest can do. This has stayed the same for several years. It has changed in the way in which it worked. Sometimes it was Prayer of Healing with Spirit Shell, then it was spamming Power War Shield, then at the start of Shadowlands we went back to Spirit Shell. So the whole idea of the Absorb Shield has always been a very prized feature, only available to Discipline, which has kept them very, very viable and very, very popular as a spec in raids particularly. If anything, the favoritism in this case is not that they were given a lot of attention, more like the opposite. They have been left to their original state of the only absorb heal spec for super long, and considering how strong it is, then it means it is being looked at with some favoritism by Blizzard. Surely. Another spec that has to hand here has to be Restoration Druid. Restoration Druid is another spec that this start of Shadowlands is not particularly strong, at the very least not to the level that they used to have for several years at this point. They had dominated 4 years in a row of Mythic Plus. Sometimes they were paired by something like a Mistweaver for a couple of seasons, sometimes a Holy Paladin, but for the majority of the time it was just Resto Druid City. In Red Encounters they were still very, very good, even as the multiple videos I've made over time pointing out how strong damage reduction and strong raid cooldowns are in raid. Restoration Druid has been the spec that consistently continued to make it into the raids even without having any of that. Mistweavers were getting left behind, Holy Priests were getting left behind, but not Restoration Druid. There is plenty of room to leave, more attention and more cure given around the toolkit of Restoration Druid and Druid in general. They have multiple forms, they can shapeshift into doing damage as a healer, and of course when doing damage as a healer became more and more important, Restoration Druids were in the front row of being able to benefit from this feature. The only other spec that started benefiting even more than Restoration Druid from this feature was Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin makes it as the second favorite for Blizzard. They have been designed themselves as well as a healer. For a long time they were considered the tank healer. You would just put them on the tank, you would use Beacon, you would spam Holy Light on them constantly. It was a pretty sad job, but there were very, very few specs that could do it better than them. Then they were turned into a raid healer. They were even given a entire different way to play the game, also benefiting from it, because now doing damage as a healer is very good. So this new build around using damaging abilities like Crusader Strike or Judgment or Hammer of Wrath is actually really helpful with this new meta of healers in the more modern part of WoW. They have remained, for example, the only healer that has an immunity for itself and can even give an immunity to someone else with Blessing of Protection. Not a single other healer can do either, and they can do both, so this must certainly mean that they have been given some superior treatment by Blizzard. Shaman, Restoration Shaman doesn't quite make it at the top simply because of how left behind they have been in Mythic Plus, and historically, not recently, but historically also in PvP, they've not been nearly as good. Now they're doing better, but for a long time, other specs as the aforementioned Restoration Druid, even Monk in its good seasons, and Holy Paladin as well, they have all been doing better than Shaman, so Shaman has been consistently good and consistently being shown pretty good treatment in raid encounters when it comes to balancing the spec, but outside of the raid encounter they lose too much. as opposed to Holy Paladin and Restoration Druid, which have shown over the years to have gotten very, very powerful in other avenues, in other activities in the game, as opposed to Shaman. Now we can move, finally, to the DPS, after going through the tank and the healers. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of conspiracy theories, plenty of tinfoil hattery going on when it comes to DPS. Looking first at the ranged DPS, we can immediately start cutting away a bunch of DPS, because we can be certain that they have not really been shown too much of any preferential treatment. We can go over Demonology Warlock, we can go over Elemental Shaman, we can go over Arcane Mage, even Frost Mage. It's somewhat safe to say that over the years, these specs, they haven't really been given too much attention. They have been left alone for a long time. Blizzard has decided some of these specs have to work that way, and they haven't really changed them for a long time. For example, Arcane Mage still has its 2 comfy buttons and has had them for like 15 fucking years. Frost Mage is the same, ever since Frost Mage started working with Brain Freeze and Fingers of Frost and Ice Lance. They have basically been like that since forever, so they have not been shown really much of anything from Blizzard. The specs that have been given something, on the other hand, are Shadow Priest, Balanced Druid are at the top immediately, evident. Shadow Priest is a little bit of a weird one because they have been shown attention, but there might be contention as to whether or not it was beneficial, because Priest has gone through quite a good amount of reworks as a DPS spec. They have changed a lot over the years, from how they worked in Mists, and then they got changed in Warlords, and then they got super changed with the addition of Void Form and Surrender to Madness in Legion. That was a bit too ham with the whole Void Form thing, a little bit too aggressive, so they toned it down and changed it again in BFA, and now they changed it again to basically remove the entire Void Form thing and just leave it as a fixed cooldown. So the attention has been given to Shadow Priest. They have been shown the attention. It's just that sometimes, or many times, it did not quite get the good results that Shadow Priests were hoping for. We can say that. But at the very least, as a glass half full, Blizzard was looking at you. They didn't completely forget you like an Arcane Mage. On the opposite side, Balanced Druid also has gotten quite a few changes on how it's ping-pong, left and right, bob and weave of Astral Power and Eclipse works. It has gotten, unlike Shadow Priest, a bit more successful than the Priest counterpart. They have gotten to be very popular and very strong for multiple tiers, multiple seasons and multiple expansions by this point. It is certainly the hybrid spec out of all of the hybrid specs in the game for DPS, so we can just jump into the melee DPS as well. The hybrid spec that has been given the most average, high-performing power, strength than all of the others. When you go and pick up Windwalker, Enhancement, Elemental, Retribution, even its little brother, its little deformed, demented brother Feral Druid, all of these have not gotten to have the same level of power of a Balanced Druid over the course of several expansions, and why they get it to the top of the conspiracy theories for being a favored one is the fact that this also happened through multiple reworks. It's not that Blizzard said, okay, BFA is launching, the Balanced Druid abilities are gonna be doing 30% more damage, that's it. This happened with passive changes, talent changes, extra Azerite trait additions, and a series of other things which made the spec become stronger. So good attention being shown by Blizzard to balance. I mentioned that Frost and Arcane have not been shown too often, too much attention. However, there is one spec of Mage which did get attention quite often, which is Fire. It is quite impressive. Okay, Fire has been, for example, a top performer in Highmall, in BRF, and in HFC for basically the entirety of Worlds of Draenor. They get into Legion, again, they are one of the better performing specs in Emerald Nightmare. They have a bit of a pause, actually, in Nighthold, where after the nerfs they get to be the lowest performing of basically all of the ranged, but all of this gets forgiven and forgotten by Blizzard, because back into Tomb of Sargeras they are again one of the better performing specs. Into Antorus they are still the best performing mage spec by a landslide. You get into BFA, they are slow to start, okay? In Uldir they're not doing too hot, in BOD same thing, they are not very strong, and then they keep the engine running, and in Eternal Palace and Nyalotha they are the best spec, which transitions into Castonatria, which is again one of the better specs, and even now in Sanctum Domination Fire Mage is likely going to end up being, once again, the better performing mage spec. So it is quite different than what Arcane and Frostmage have gotten, both in terms of the reworks and the changes that have been given to the other two mage specs compared to the Fire Mage spec. This is probably one of the bigger points of contention when it comes to conspiracy theories, maybe even by many mage players, okay? Maybe there are many mage players that wish that one day Arcane is the strongest spec overall because they just like and prefer playing Arcane, but every time their hopes are shattered, their dreams are ruined because it's Fire Mage's turn again. So if I were to look at the favored children of Blizzard when it comes to ranged, I would go for Balanced Druid and Fire Mage, even though, funnily enough, Balanced Druid and Fire Mage right now are in the bottom 8 of all performers in raid encounters, for example. Now, what about the melee DPS? Okay, fine, melee DPS, we can go back to what we did with ranged and immediately remove any possible nut jobs thinking about conspiracy theories that want Enhancement Shaman or Survival Hunter or Feral Druid, but even Frost DK or Subtlety Rogue or even Assassination Rogue as some sort of favored specs by Blizzard conspiracy, because clearly it's not the case, okay? These specs have not gotten to be very popular for nearly enough time that would warrant even thinking about Blizzard favoring them over time. I forgot Retribution Paladin in there as well, we can take it out pretty quickly, as well as Windwalker. Windwalker, however, is probably in a worse situation because they have been given something unique, something new at the time, which was Storm, Earth and Fire. They have been working with that for years by now. The spec has been working very similarly, only that the few minute details in how the rotation worked would change every once in a while, but the bad part is that the bugs and the bad interactions centered most of the time around Storm, Earth and Fire have continued for years. So it makes not being looked at by Blizzard even worse, because it's not that you're weak, it's that sometimes, more often than not, you have been weak, and on top of that, you even have been plagued by bugs for a long time. So it might feel even worse than being straight up ignored, like Announcement Shaman, for example. At the very least, good attention has been given to Enhancement Shamans at the start of Shadowlands. They have been reworked quite nicely. The spec is very smooth. It's pretty enjoyable to play. They have multiple ways to play it and talent setups to play it with. It's not performing very well. It's not doing too great. It's not even that popular. But at the very least, it has been made better and more enjoyable to play. So, of course, instead of talking at the bottom, let's touch on what is going to be the number one. The number one headcanon for favored child of Blizzard when it comes to melee, which has to be Havoc, right? This has got to be the more popular answer from almost everyone except for Havoc players. Havoc has been released basically as a hero class as per Blizzard's announcement. They have been given tons of free things, extra things that other melee DPS did not get access to, so it makes them special in multiple ways. From having an instant AoE stun, to a ranged interrupt, to an offensive dispel, to an immunity, a double jump, a double dash, even a back leap, even something like a raid cooldown like Darkness, and a mandatory raid debuff like Chaos Brand. So a series of things given to Havoc. You know, I can already see a Feral Druid playing Druid for a decade, having access to Mark of the Wild as a raid buff, and then in Legion, a cringy, edgy anime class is being released, and Blizzard makes raid buffs much more scarce and much more powerful, and takes away from the game Mark of the Wild just to give Chaos Brand to Demon Hunters. I can already see the pictures on the walls, all the connected dots, trying to figure out how and why exactly is Blizzard doing this in favor of Havoc. I can already see it, the conspiracy unfolding in front of me. And that would be my pick as well, for the record. Havoc has been given quite a lot of help. Another thing I mentioned about Havoc, for example, is that the base strength of the spec is pretty weak, and in both of the previous expansions they had to be bailed out by borrowed powers. This means that if you have to be bailed out by borrowed powers, you have to be bailed out by Blizzard, designing and planning the borrowed powers. So in Legion, they had very powerful legendaries. They became and stayed one of the more popular and stronger melee specs. In BFA, they got Azerite traits, as well as later on corruptions, which also bailed them out, and also again made them one of the strongest melee specs for the entirety of BFA. We got into Shadowlands, and for a moment, similar to Fire Mage, they are pretty weak. They are not played a lot, to the point that Vengeance even rises in popularity because of the aforementioned raid debuff being needed in the raid, and now from 9.0.5 and a continued string of buffs, as well as some retuning of the legendaries, now getting into 9.1, Havoc Demon Hunter is now performing much better. It is, to be fair, many of the melee DPS specs performing better in raids, because even if Havoc is in the top half, there are like 6 different melee DPS specs doing better than them, for example. But this betterment, this improvement of Havoc has been continued in Mythic Plus, for example, because now they are the most popular melee DPS Mythic Plus spec again. So this sort of down phase of Havoc was only allowed by Blizzard for one tier, for Castanatria. For the entirety of Legion and then BFA and then the second tier of Shadowlands, Havoc has been at the top. So when you see that, you obviously can't help but wonder, why is it happening? Why isn't it the turn of survival? Why isn't Frost DK being buffed? Why isn't it the time of Retribution? So Havoc is a pretty easy, it's a pretty simple pick when it comes to being favored. The last one, this is likely going to be a fight between people being convinced of this, whether or not it's the warrior or whether or not it's the rogue. This might also have a lot more in common and is going to be a lot more dear to PvP players that might have different opinions. Warrior has pretty much had one powerful spec, one of the two, for every tier since the dawn of mankind. Castanatria, at the very least before 9.0.5, so when it was still important, the progress in Castanatria, was basically one of the first tiers where both warrior specs were pretty poor. Pretty poor. Then eventually Fury had gotten buffed multiple times, and by 9.0.5 it was performing much better. But prior to that, prior to Shadowlands in the previous expansions and in the previous tiers, Arms and Fury had consistently done very, very well. So again, someone looking for a conspiracy, someone looking for any sort of favoritism is starting to wonder, why didn't this happen to Enhancement once in a while? Why didn't this happen to Retribution, to Survival, to Windwalker, to Feral, to Frost DK? Why is it always the warrior specs? So tier after tier, month after month, year after year of this concept being repeated, and it's going to be easy to guess that many people are going to have some qualms against warriors. Something similar can then be said as a last note against rogues, right? That's the other spec that has been up there, so to speak, for the most time. Subtlety is the only one off in this. Subtlety is the one that for a long time has not really been given the same amount of attention. Subtlety did have some sort of, growth over time, like scaling. By the end of the expansion, they were bad for the majority of Warlords and did very, very well at the end during Hellfire. They were also bad for the first part, the first half of Legion, and then they got better by the end. In BFA, that wasn't even the case. They were shit from the start. They saw 5 minutes of fame during Zul, and then they went back into anonymity. And at the start of Shadowlands, they were still bad, since they were one of the least played specs. They had to fight with Survival to not be the least played, and only now, after another string of buffs, them together with Assassination, they have started to see a little bit more play. So the rogue favoritism would be a little bit closer to just be Outlaw. Outlaw has been the other spec, the only spec that beat Havoc when it comes to popularity and representation in Mythic Plus. Throughout Legion, throughout BFA, and even now throughout Shadowlands, it's Outlaw that is the king, and has also been pretty well represented in raids as well. Even now, in current year, Outlaw is the 4th best performing spec in the entirety of the DPS options in raid, while also being one of the best options for Mythic Plus. So that would be another easy pick if I were to think about some foul play when it comes to Blizzard and being fair to all of its children. There are definitely some stepchildren in here not being given the much needed attention. So these were my picks when it comes to this. Holy Paladin and Restoration Druid for healers, Warrior and Monk for tanks, Fire Mage and Balanced Druid for range DPS, as well as Arms and Fury Warrior plus Havoc and Outlaw for melee DPS. Let me guys know about your conspiracy theories. I want to know if there is anyone with some 237 IQ 40-page essay about why in reality it's Demonology Warlock to be the favorite of Blizzard. Maybe you will be able to open everyone's eyes about this, wake up all of us sheeple. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you have enjoyed the content and you want to support the channel, leave a like and a comment. And then eventually, if you're convinced, subscribe to the channel as well. See you guys soon, and In the meantime, there was no more Coke, so I went for Pepsi. I am not a fan